Legacy. There was a commotion amongst the protesters sitting ahead of Chung Ming, who realized there must be some police action going on. In fact, that's exactly why they were here. All of them sat, one next to another as closely as possible, with their hands holding one another as tight as possible. They have been here for 3 hours. Chung Ming started feeling hungry, and he knew the police also were well aware of it. They waited until all the protesters were exhausted before expelling them. During the 3 hours, water bottles had been passed on carefully. When one got it, he or she loosened one hand to take the bottle from the person next to him at one side, who had just loosened his or her other hand to take the bottle. So they could drink water and their hands had several seconds to relax in turn. When one was done with the water bottle, their hands held again. Then Chung Ming felt his hand was massaged by the person passing on the water from his right side, so he started massaging the hand of the person he just passed the water to on his left. The waves of taking care of one another were passing on and on. Chung Ming's heart was warmed. Chung Ming was actually glad the police were taking action. He wished it to be ended soon because he was so tired. He had a quarrel with his boyfriend last night. It was more energy-consuming than anything. They had been together nearly 4 years, and recently his being unemployed became a problem between them because living expenses in Taipei went up so much. Chung Ming wanted to be a novelist. He wanted to write about the dark side of cities, the helplessness and haplessness of people in cities. But it was not a practical plan for the future. What had been his idealism became a burden in his relationship. Chung Ming couldn't help but wonder, were the people next to him holding his hand so tightly homophobic? How would they respond if they knew he was gay? The commotion in the front rows seemed to be elevated. Some of them were moving. Screams of girls could be heard, followed by shouts of boys around them. Now Chung Ming saw that they were not moving. They were split by police one by one and carried away. Obviously, the actions of splitting their tightly held hands caused great pain, and some girls began to cry, and boys next to them tried to push away the police. Now he saw they were circled by hundreds of policemen with shields and batons. Chung Ming's heart skipped a beat. The circle was getting smaller and smaller as the policemen were approaching the protesters. Should he resist as much as he could, or should he avoid getting himself hurt? But before he could make up his mind, the police had already got him and the people next to him. The boy on his right began to forcefully kick the 2 policemen, pulling them apart, so Chung Ming also began to struggle wildly, and the 2 policemen hit back with their batons mercilessly. It really hurt, Chung Ming thought. Nevertheless, he fought even more furiously. "Cuff them up," a voice with authority ordered. Then, during the kicking and tearing, Chung Ming felt he was pulled upside down, and suddenly, when his vision was back again, his head was relentlessly being smashed on the ground, and his hands were cuffed at his back before he was violently thrown into the back of a police van. He couldn't tell where the pain was from, his head, his shoulder, or his hip. In the police station, he was seated with several other protesters. One of their hands was cuffed to an iron metal bar fixed to the wall. The police handled things slowly on purpose. They rang the prosecutor but hung up immediately, saying, "The DA is busy," leaving their detainees sitting there uncomfortably thirsty and hungry. Suddenly, Chung Ming felt a buzzing in the back pocket of his jeans. He realized the cell phone he had held temporarily for his teacher from graduate school had been with him since last night. They met up shortly before he left the protest, and his teacher joined the protest for the night. Chung Ming took out the cell phone and answered. "Hello?" An old woman's voice spoke in Taiwanese.
What's going on there?
"This is not Professor Cao. This is Wang Chung Ming, his student." Chung Ming replied with his not-so-fluent Taiwanese.
So where's your teacher now?
"I don't know. I'm in the police station."
You are arrested?
"Yes, we were protesting."
Which police station?
The woman seemed to be aware of the situation. She did not wait until Chung Ming finished his explanation. "Da'an Station."
I will send the lawyer over now. What's your name again?
"Chung Ming. Wang Chung Ming."
Good. Your lawyer will be there soon.
Then the phone was hung up. A policeman stood up from his desk and walked toward him. Trying to grab his cell phone, Chung Ming resisted.
I have right to make a phone call.
You just made it.
No, I answered a phone call. Now I am making a phone call.
Chung Ming dialed the number of his friend Bokai. This is Chung Ming.
Where are you, bro?
In Dian Police Precinct.
Fuck.
Someone said a lawyer will be coming to represent me.
Who is someone?
I don't know.
I will check around and see what we can do, bro.
Bokai briefed him on the situation of the other protesters. Most of them were all right, except some had slight bruises. They were having meetings to talk about what steps to take next. About half an hour later, a lawyer showed up. A young man who looked like he was going to a party instead of the court. What charge do you have for Mr. Wang Chung Ming? He inquired of the policeman on duty. Violation of the Assembly and Parade Act, the policeman answered.
How long has it been since you did your homework? Don't you know that the Supreme Court has ruled that the Assembly and Parade Act is against the Constitution law? People are free to gather up in anywhere they like without needing to tell you in advance.
Another policeman quickly corrected. Obstruction of law enforcement.
What law you guys were enforcing?
The young lawyer asked with contempt.
Forcing people out of their homes, I see,
he added to himself. Chung Ming was bailed out, together with all the other protesters. The cell phone was returned to him, and he called back to the old woman to thank her, although Chung Ming wondered how he was going to pay for the lawyer's legal service.
I am released, thanks. I am having dinner with your teacher at Jinhua Noodle tonight. Come to join us.
Jinhua Noodle Store was near where he was arrested, only 1 lane away from the Sinolite community. Before the community was scheduled for demolition, the noodle store was a humble stall by the side exit of the community. People in this neighborhood often got takeout there, and the taxi drivers dined there in the night. The yellow light from the light bulbs hanging from the wall warmed people in the night, although the electricity came from some suspicious source. In the age before the convenience stores found everywhere, people working overnight or students studying late could get some noodles here for a late-night snack. There were 4 people for the dinner, his teacher, Professor Cao, and his mother, who was the caller and his savior, and the lawyer who bailed him out. They had dried noodles with sticky and oily sesame paste, fishball soup, greens, and beer. It was like a family gathering. They chatted about common things like every night after an uneventful day. Chung Ming ate quietly. It was the first meal he had for a whole day. Professor Cao seemed to notice how hungry Chung Ming was. He ordered pig feet for him and told him it was for his release from the detention. It's a custom in Taiwan to have pig feet after bad things happened, so the bad luck won't come again. After dinner, they walked past the site of their protest. After the evacuation in the morning, it was barricaded by barbed wire and spired steel barricades. Bulldozers would come any day to demolish the old houses. The lawyer took out a cigarette and lit it. His eyebrows burrowed when gazing at the evacuated buildings. Then he breathed out a big whiff of cigarette smoke. The memories a city contains are worth nothing compared to the capital a development could generate through urban gentrification. Before departing, Chung Ming learned from his business card that the lawyer's name was Wu Chi-sin. He still looked like he was going to a party. Chung Ming went home and took a shower to wash away all the dirt he got from sitting by the rubble for 3 hours and all afternoon in the police station. His boyfriend was away, but from the rearranged items of their room, Chung Ming felt that they might make up soon. He really did not have more energy to fight. He crashed and fell asleep immediately. Professor Cao's mother was called Grandma Cao by the students of his son. She made delicious kimchi, and many of them were given a jar every time she made a batch. The lawyer Wu Chi-sin's fee for representing Chung Ming was 2 jars of kimchi. Democratic kimchi. The lawyer received them happily. Democratic kimchi had a long history dating back to the 1970s, when Grandma Cao was still a housewife in her 30s. One time, her husband told her that he had a friend studying in Michigan wishing to set up a periodical, but had no money. He felt obliged to find money for his friend.
What kind of periodical is he establishing? social, political issues, a rather academic journal.
It was beyond Miss Cow to perceive why a Taiwanese wanted to set up an academic journal about social and political issues in the U.S., and why her husband wanted to help him. Mr. Cow was working for a Presbyterian church as a deacon. The pay was very thin, and they could make their ends meet only because the church provided them monthly rent for a humble apartment, and their kids were able to take free programs organized by the church. It was really impossible to squeeze any extra money to assist his friend's dream. Mrs. Cow was worried, but she knew when her husband mentioned something, he must have made up his mind already. The next morning, Mrs. Cow suddenly found a way to make a little bit more money. When she came home from food market, she carried so many bags of Napa cabbage, she could hardly stand straight. "What are you doing?" Seeing his wife moving bags of vegetables awkwardly, Mr. Cow rushed to help her.
"I have a good idea to make some money to help your friend in the U.S."
Mr. Cow looked at the bags scattered all over the floor with a suspicious expression.
"I am making kimchi to sell."
"So you bought all these cabbage?"
"They are very cheap. That's why the idea of making kimchi occurred to me. The farmers have grown too much cabbage this year, so the prices fall to almost nothing. I got all these with just a couple of $100, and the vendors were so thankful."
"Good." Mr. Cow was happy to hear that the solution served for all. "Let me help then. How to start?" Mrs. Cow stood straight up, looking at her husband, bemused.
"I don't know. I never made kimchi."
That was how the business of democratic kimchi began. In the age without internet, they had to ask around the recipes of making kimchi and test out each way they were told. Kimchi was not traditional Taiwanese food, and information about Korean food or Japanese food was so partial or twisted. The first time they only made about 20 jars. Most of the Napa cabbage were wasted in failed attempts. But people helped them so much. Some wrote letters to total strangers to ask for tips for them. Some joined the labor. Some just put money for future purchase. And some persuaded their neighbors to buy without knowing clearly why Mrs. Cow needed to make money from this business. Later, the democratic kimchi not only funded the journal, it also became the major source of the flight tickets for some political dissidents to sneak back to Taiwan. And after Mr. Cow was arrested and tortured for the alleged crime of treason, and finally killed in the prison, it was how Mrs. Cow sustained herself and raised up their 3 children. Over the last 2 decades, when the post-martial law society gradually opened up and the public awareness of the environmental conservation or cultural heritage preservation had been elevated, democratic kimchi helped activists raise money to organize their concerts or marches, among other events. In some cases of more acute resistance against the law enforcement, democratic kimchi paid for the legal service. More and more lawyers joined the team of volunteer defenders. Wu Chi-sin was one of them. Grandma Cow called Wu Chi-sin to represent Chung Ming also because Wu Chi-sin was born and raised up in the Sinolite community, where dormitories for judges and prosecutors were built, and they had lived for decades. The compounds, consisting of 3 4-floor structures with an atrium in each structure, provided children the safest places to play. Here they had played soccer, learned how to ride bicycles, and raced their wall climbing skills. Wu Chi-sin's father was the chief judge of a criminal appellate court who lived in this community to the end of his life. Wu Chi-sin vaguely learned his father's ambivalent feelings towards this nation he had fought for during the World War. He knew his father had been under surveillance all the time, although he never talked about it. When the city government announced its plan to develop this area in the model of Manhattan, judges and prosecutors were relocated. But quite a few poor families that had set up along the fringes had no place to go. They'd made the simply constructed shacks along the community their homes since moving to Taiwan from China. To evict them, the government sued them for illegally occupying public land, demanding not only their immediate evacuation but also monetary compensation that appeared to be astronomical numbers to them. Had they the money, why would they stay in the slum-like area? It was so absurd for Chung Ming and his fellow activists to see the government deeming the right to property higher than the basic needs of people. Although from their earlier experience of protesting, like tree-sitting or anti-nuclear demonstrations, they knew by no means could they stop the state violence. But their actions would bring public attention and debates, which helped engage people to look into the very questionable development. But that was why Chung Ming's boyfriend felt so insecure. He was okay with Chung Ming's social movements, but the unpredictable lifestyle and unexpected expense resulting from Chung Ming's increasingly radical resistance agonized him. Sometimes he blamed Professor Cao for leading Chung Ming to the risks that he couldn't afford. Professor Cao might be admired and followed by many young people, but he should not suppose that everyone in his passionate cult was clear about what consequences might occur. Professor Cao studied urban planning in the U.S. with scholarships his advisors found for him. After graduate school, he worked for an architecture firm in Pennsylvania for 7 years. His mother once believed that her son might just settle down in the U.S., which suited his talents and rebellious ideas better, but he moved back to Taiwan and involved more and more in political activities. It appalled Grandma Cao. Their family was still on the blacklist of the dissidents then, and the nightmares of her husband being tortured to death reemerged. They said Mr. Cao was a traitor, a separatist for the independence of Taiwan from the Republic of China. Compared to some cultures today, when a place wants to be independent from a nation, it could be debated openly or decided by referendum. That separatism in the past could have cost tens of thousands of lives was so unbelievable. On the other hand, Grandma Cao also was very clear that in the past the government would find any excuse to silence people who talked loudly about public affairs and criticized public policies. Their loyalty or patriotism to their nation was just an excuse to subdue them. Without oppressive measures, the legitimacy of the exiled government in Taiwan could be overturned by people who suffered the inequality between social classes, who condemned the corrupt officials, or people who never identified the regime as their ruler. In a society silenced for so long, many problems then were still problems now. Only people were free to discuss them today. The coming and going of politicians was totally normal now. They were no longer worshipped like superheroes. Professor Cao resembled his father so much, although he hardly remembered him. Those dreadful days of being stalked, checked, and harassed by law enforcement and Secret Service from time to time, even years after Mr. Cao's death, were never gone far enough. Nevertheless, Grandma Cao knew it was useless to stop her son. Fortunately, thanks to the fights of his father and his fellow dissidents decades ago, expressing different ideas today was much safer. Professor Cao had been cuffed up and brought to the police station many times, but never got charged. The law enforcement knew better that the resistance might elevate once the young people's leader was charged. It also knew that picking up younger activists was a more efficient strategy to frighten and dissuade people who thought of supporting them by joining the protests. Knowing her son's freedom was given at the price of his students' confinement, Grandma Cao worked hard to make more democratic kimchi to thank them. Besides, after years of wrestling with the laws, Grandma Cao was very familiar with what legal measures they could take to protect their rights. Those dreadful memories of state violation of human rights were never far away. Half a year later, Chung Ming was sentenced to 3 months in jail for obstruction of justice. Although he could choose to pay a fine, he did not have the money to buy his freedom, and he also determined to do his time to emphasize that what he had obstructed was injustice, not justice. His lawyer appealed, with argument that protesting belonged to people's freedom of speech against state violence. So did their resistance to being arrested. He contended that the freedom of speech of this country was not comprehensive, for the government first used the Assembly and Parade Act to control people's activities, and after it was decided unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, the excuse of obstruction of justice was used in the most abusive manner. To their disappointment, the appellate court dismissed their appeal. The decision of the district court was maintained. The good thing was, the development to duplicate a Manhattan in Taipei was put off. Before going to jail, Chung Ming, Professor Cao, his lawyer, and other protesters organized a press conference to loudly criticize the government's violation of human rights by forcing people from their homes first, then confining people expressing their disagreement. The dreadful violation of human rights by the state was never far away. Chung Ming brought 2 jars of democracy kimchi for his time in the prison. And when he began his days in the prison, he immediately realized that the human rights of prisoners was another ugly issue needing to be dealt with.